Hi everyone. In this series of videos, we'll build our own to-do application from scratch. The application itself will be very simple, but we'll really go through all the steps necessary in order to make this a real production-like application. So the application itself will not have that many features. It will just support adding some to-dos. It will support doing actually the to-dos, so to moving them to the done column, and we could also delete some of these to-dos. So the functionalities are very basic, but really we'll go step by step through all the necessary components that you need. So we'll start by setting our own environment. We'll write all the HTML, CSS, and JavaScript necessary. We will establish our Express server with Node.js backend. We'll connect these to a Postgres database. And then after we do that, we will commission our server. We'll create deployment pipelines with Docker. And we'll configure our server and we'll configure a custom domain which will be attached to the server. So really the purpose here will be for me to go with you step by step so you can really learn the whole process that is necessary to build your own application. Okay, so without further ado, the first point on our list is we need to set up all the necessary dev tools for us to get started. To follow these tutorials, you'll need a few things installed locally on your computer. First thing is a Postgres database. The installation process is super simple. You just go to the Postgres sql.org/download, you choose your operating system. The version really doesn't matter here. We'll not be using any advanced Postgres features. So you just install it locally on your machine. Then you'll need a code editor. I recommend Visual Studio Code because it's pretty awesome. I will also be using it in these tutorials, so if you want to follow closely, I recommend you do go to code.visualstudio.com and you download it for Windows if Windows is your operating system. And also what you will need is Node.js, so go to nodejs.org and you once again select your operating system and you just download and install it here. It's also pretty simple. Now you don't need to use Postgres, you don't need to use Visual Studio Code, but you do need to use Node. You can use a different database, you can use a different code editor, but Node is what brings it really together. And also, if you want, you can have the database, so for example, Postgres installed on your local machine using Docker. So if you have the correct Windows distribution or if you are using Linux, then you can, it will be relatively simple to you to just install Docker and install Postgres. However, for the beginning of these videos, I will be using just a version of Postgres that I will have locally installed on my machine. One more thing you will need is a GitHub account. So just go to github.com, click on sign up, and it will take you through the process. And GitHub is the most popular version control system. Many companies use it, or they use an alternative. And what is great about GitHub is that it's free. So I would recommend to install it. It's not necessary for you. However, I strongly suggest once again to set up the account. After you create your account, now we need to create a repository. And the repository in GitHub is a place where we store different versions of our code. So let's go in here. Let's go to your repositories. Now let's click on new and we will create a new repository. And here we can name the repository somehow. I will name my todos-app, but you can name it whatever you want. And then we will just provide a short description. So I will say simple to-do app. And I will click on create repository. So here you can choose if it's public or private, doesn't really matter. And then you can include a number of files, but I just like to include them manually later on. Okay. So we'll click on create repository and the repository has been created. Here we have a number of ways how you can push your code here to the repository. but we will do that later on. And the GitHub repository for us will be very important because throughout the process of creating this application, I would like to show you a simplified process of how a real-world application will be built. So it's not only about writing the code, but it's also about versioning the code, also about testing the code, also about developing the application in an iterative manner. So we will be developing an application, sort of the first MVP, so the minimum viable product of our application, and then we will be adding new features on top. So this is how we would develop applications in an agile approach. And this is why we are currently, instead of jumping right into code, we are currently taking our time to prepare all these tools that we will be using. Now what we will need is we'll need to copy this URL. So let's copy this and let's jump to Visual Studio Code to configure this GitHub repository. And what you'll also need is Git itself, because GitHub is just a platform, so it's just a user interface that allows you to see your repositories, your branches, your commits, and what really handles the version control also on your local machine is Git itself. So you go to git-scm.com/downloads, and you once again select your operating system and download the appropriate version. So after we have set up our GitHub account, now what we need to do is we need to connect the GitHub account or the repository from the GitHub account to our local file system. And what we are seeing currently is just plain Visual Studio Code. I have just opened it and I have created a new folder, and then I went into the options and I clicked on open folder and I opened the folder. And currently, as you can see, it's empty. So what we will do now is we will connect the repository from our GitHub account to our local file system. There are multiple ways you can do that. Visual Studio Code has built-in source control integration. However, what I will show you is I will do it over the command line, because then you are able to do that whenever you want and using whatever tool you want. You are not dependent on a tool that you're using having a built-in source control integration. So first thing you need to do is you need to say git init. What this will do is this will initialize an empty repository for you. Behind the scenes, it has created a .git folder where all the Git options are stored. So some people say where all the Git magic happens. The second thing what we need to do is we need to add an origin. So we need to say git remote add origin, and we need to copy this URL right here. We now have a slightly different view here that shows us some changes, or it would show us some changes if there were any. Okay, so let's check out the status of our repository. It says that we are on branch master, but we have no commits yet, and that we can use git add to track some files. Okay, so it seems that our Git integration has been successful. We can now try it out by creating some files and pushing them to our remote repository. In order to do that, I'll create a new folder here. I will call it app. And inside this app folder, I will create a new file and I will call it index.html. Okay, inside this index.html, I will say HTML5. And what this will do, because of the extension that I have installed in Visual Studio Code, it will print out the basic HTML messages or HTML options that you should include in your files. Now, I will not, over the course of these videos, I will not explain the syntax or the basic options that I will be using, because I do believe that there are many amazing free courses online where you can learn it very easily. For example, the front-end development course at Free Code Camp is amazing. You can use that. And I believe if you go over the course, you'll understand all the basics concepts about the technologies, especially the front-end technologies that we'll be using. So I will not do that. What I will explain is a little bit more advanced concepts that we'll be using. Okay, but currently we have our file. For now, it's, of course, if we were to open this index.html file, it will be a completely empty file. But what we now can do is we now can push these changes to our remote repository. So let's say git status once again. We still see nothing, but now we see that we have this app folder. So in order to add them to the staging area, in other words, to tell Git that it should track these files in this folder, we can say git add dot. And what this dot means is that I want to track everything that is in my current in the current repository or in the current folder that I'm in. Okay, so git add that dot, and then we say git commit -m and -m, and we do a and we do some quotation marks. And inside these quotation marks, we will insert our commit message. So in a commit message, what you will usually say is what changes and or why you made certain changes. But as it's our first commit, we'll just say initial commit. And we have now tracked the changes. We have created a commit. So a commit is like a snapshot of your file system. And now what we'll do, we'll say git push. And we see a message which basically tells us that the branch that we currently do have in our local Git repository is not yet in the remote Git repository. So I will copy this message. Once again, I will copy this message and I will paste it right here. And now, as you can see by the messages here, our branch has been successfully pushed to our remote repository. We'll inspect it in a second, but what will happen here, if you have never done that before, is Git will ask you for a password and a username, and you need to provide that. And be aware that since quite some time, Git has dropped the support for passwords, so you will most likely have to go to Git to generate a token that you will use in order to access your repository. So we are now in the GitHub repository. I have not refreshed it yet since I have pushed the files here. I will now hit F5 to refresh it. And what we can see is we have our app folder, and inside the app folder we have our index.html file. This means that we have successfully pushed our newest changes to our Git repository. And by the way, the access token I told you about that you should use instead of a password, you can generate by going here and then into settings, and then scrolling down here into developer settings, and then going to personal access tokens. Here you can generate new tokens that you can use instead of password. So after we know that we have successfully pushed the first initial commit to our repository, let's just now see if we can push some changes there. So what I have here is our index.html file that I have just opened here in my browser on the right hand side. You can do that very easily by selecting the file, clicking on Reveal in File Explorer, and then just opening the file using your web browser of choice. But now let's actually write something. Let's create an h1 tag and let's say to do app. Let's save it right here and let's hit F5 here. And we can see that here it works. That's good. And we immediately get a notification that we have one pending change that we can commit to our repository. So let's open a new terminal here. Let's once again say git add dot git commit added h1 tag. Let's say git push. Okay, and we can see that our changes have been pushed. So in the future, instead of using the terminal here, now that we know how to do it, I will be using the Git integration here. It's actually much more convenient. You just write a commit message here, and then you click on sync changes, and it does everything that you need for you. And that would be it for the first part of the video, where we prepared our tools, we prepared our development environment, and in the next video we'll go into writing the HTML code or the basic HTML code so that we will get an idea of how our application should look like, what are the things that we'll need to build the first version of our application. But for now, thank you very much, and I will see you in the next video from this series.